Girl falls 10,000 feet from plane and leaves the rescue team speechless. Teenager Julianne Koepke didn't watch her life flash before her eyes as she plummeted 10,000 feet towards dense jungle terrain. That's because she was knocked unconscious at the complete and total mercy of the storm that put her into that position to begin with. When she came to, somehow alive, a new mission not on her initial travel itinerary crystallized: find mom and find rescue or die. In 1971, German citizen and respected South American bird researcher Maria Koepke planned a holiday vacation with her 17-year-old daughter Julianne. Leaving from Peru, their itinerary was simple, but it turned completely deadly. Maria planned to meet up with her husband for Christmas, so she booked tickets on the Peruvian airline Líneas Aéreas Nacionales S.A. or LANSA. A time before Yelp and Google reviews, the ornithologist didn't know the airline's reputation. See, during the 60s and 70s, LANSA was the fastest way to travel from one Peruvian city to another. However, despite offering frequent flights, the airline was plagued with fatal mishaps. In 1966, for instance, LANSA Flight 501 careened into a mountain, killing all on board. A few years later, LANSA Flight 502 crashed. Of the 100 passengers, only one survived, and the crash took the lives of 2 more people on the ground. Yet, even with its history, LANSA was still the go-to airline. In December 1971, Flight 508 took off from the capital city of Lima. With a small crew and less than 100 passengers, including Maria and Julianne, the takeoff went as planned. But any hopes of a safe trip were dashed just 40 minutes into the flight when the small plane flew into a thunderstorm. Suddenly, a bright light lit up the aircraft. Lightning had struck the fuel tank. The right wing of the plane broke away as passengers let out screams. Christmas gifts and luggage were sent flying into the storm as the pilot lost the last bit of control. The plane nosedived. Julianne and Maria held each other tight. In an interview with BBC's Outlook, Julianne vividly remembers the crash. Her mother said, "That's the end, it's all over." And then, tragically, her daughter was ripped from her side as Julianne's seat was pulled from the carriage. She flew into the storm before plummeting to the earth. Everything went black. When Julianne awoke, she found herself still trapped to her seat and completely alone. She was alive somehow. It seemed the dense jungle had broken her fall enough to allow her to survive. She took stock of her injuries. Her collarbone was broken and there were deep wounds along her arms and legs. Even worse, with her glasses lost in the crash, the nearsighted Julianne had to navigate with bad vision. Her first instinct was to locate her mother. Julianne called out, but the only sounds she could hear were that of the jungle. She had to think of a new plan. If she could find help, then maybe they could locate her mother and any other survivors. Wearing only short, sleeveless dress and sandals, Julianne tried to shake away any fears. After all, she'd spent over a year with her family at a research center in the Amazon. She wasn't a stranger to the Peruvian jungles, so she pulled from her knowledge. Because her sight was limited, Julianne used her sandal to strike the ground before her in an effort to scare away any dangerous creatures. Half blind, she stumbled into the crash site where she searched for any food or water. The only thing she could find were some candies. So she kept moving. After finding a creek, Julianne stayed in the waters and followed them downstream, a safer approach than staying on land. During the day, the sun burned her. At night, she froze, but she had a strong will to survive. On the 4th day, Julianne recognized the sounds of a king vulture. She knew from her parents' research that from the predator bird, a large mass of dead flesh was nearby. Julianne was horrified when she saw what the birds had noticed: the crash site. Passengers were still strapped to their seat, but unlike Julianne, the fall had rammed them into the ground head first. Julianne got close enough to see her mother was not among them. She continued on, her injuries getting worse. Maggots were all over her wounds, causing infection, and on the 10th day, as she wandered into a river, Julianne questioned her sanity. Up ahead, she saw something that truly didn't make sense. There was a motorboat in the near distance, docked along the riverbank. A mirage, she thought. Who would live out in the dense Peruvian jungle? As she neared the boat, however, she realized it was very real. Her stomach turned. Did she want to meet the owner? Desperate and nearing death, Julianne investigated. After finding a small path, she found a hut with a gasoline can nearby. She remembered her father had once used gasoline on the wound of a family pet once, which gave her an idea. The pain was sharp as Julianne sucked gasoline out of the can and tried to clean her wounds as best as she could. Exhausted, she passed out right there in the hut, unaware she was crashing an occupied home. The next morning, local boatmen discovered her in the hut, bloody, covered in maggots, and smelling like gasoline. They were frightened, believing her to be a water spirit from their folk tales. Weak, Julianne talked to the boatman in the little Spanish she knew, and thankfully they understood. The men did their best to treat her wounds, and after a 7-hour boat ride brought Julianne to a hospital. When she finally saw her father, they hugged in silence. After a rescue party found Maria Kopke's body, Julianne learned her mother had indeed survived the plane crash, but only for a few days. Julianne is still haunted by what her mother's final days must have been like. No one fared well in the Amazon. Julianne kicked her own experience around in her head. Was there something she could have done differently to save her mother? It wasn't until she heard the story of Josef or Yossi Ginsburg that she understood how incredibly lucky she was. Yossi was no ordinary man. Born in Tel Aviv 1959, he traveled the world optimistic, yet unaware he'd encounter a life-or-death situation that never seemed to end. As a young man, he joined the Israeli military. To his delight as a Navy recruit, he not only got to travel out of the country, but he also learned many survival tips, became fit and strong, and saved a lot of money. Eventually, Yossi became inspired to travel to Venezuela by Henry Charrier's book Papillon, an autobiography about being wrongly convicted of murder in France, being imprisoned in French Guiana, and eventually escaping to Venezuela. So Yossi made the trip. While hitchhiking from Venezuela to Colombia to further explore South America, Yossi met a man named Marcus Stam, a teacher from Switzerland. The two traveled together, this time to La Paz, Bolivia. Soon after arriving in La Paz, the two friends went hiking in the Amazonian rainforest. While they planned their trip out to the details, they stumbled upon another eager explorer, Kevin Gale, an American wildlife explorer who couldn't wait to capture the Amazon. Before embarking into the Amazon, an Austrian man named Karl Ruprechter approached Yossi and his friends in La Paz. He claimed he was a geologist off to find a gold quarry and impressed the trio with his knowledge of terrain. They didn't hesitate to follow him into the vast and dangerous wilderness. They started their journey towards the gold quarry in a small village, Asariamas. The locals were kind and welcoming, giving them supplies and also an ominous warning: the jungle holds great peril. But set in their ways, the men didn't heed the warnings. After all, Karl was an expert and they were 4 healthy men with a strong wanderlust. The group trekked into the jungle ready to battle any obstacle. Well, not any obstacle. Marcus Strom, the Swiss teacher, began developing trench foot. As the days went on, the infection became more and more painful. He was slowing the group down and they were running out of food. Karl had a shotgun for hunting game, but the only thing the group could find were monkeys. Eating them felt wrong, but the hikers were starving. Eventually, they grilled their first monkey, but the already weakened Marcus refused to indulge. As Marcus's condition worsened, the group could no longer continue walking to Karl's promised gold quarry. Instead, they built a raft and tried to float down the Tuichi River. It was then Karl began acting suspicious and scared. Apparently, he couldn't even swim. What else was he hiding? Afraid of the water, Karl went back to the nearest village on foot, taking the weakened Marcus with him. Yossi and Kevin thought they'd be fine sailing on, but soon hit a powerful current. Kevin swam to shore, but Yossi wasn't so lucky. After getting swept down a waterfall, Yossi hit his head on the sharp rocks on the way. For half an hour, he fought to keep his wounded head above the water, gasping for each life-saving breath. When the water finally calmed down, Yossi swam to shore. However, the moment he stepped onto land, he was overwhelmed with a sense of doom. He was alone in the middle of the Amazon rainforest. How would he ever survive? Yossi's spirits lifted when he noticed his backpack miraculously resting on the river's shore. In addition to some helpful supplies, the bag contained a special book. It had brought Yossi's uncle a lot of luck during the Holocaust, and now it would hopefully help keep Yossi alive. The first danger Yossi encountered was a wild boar. Boars tend to be extremely aggressive and can rip right through the skin with their tusks. Yossi ran for his life through the jungle, eventually shaking the boar off but also wearing himself out. Less than a week into his solitude, Yossi noticed something in the sky. As it came closer, he realized it was a plane, the same type in which he'd flown to La Paz. Desperate, he called out, waving his arms up and down, but he went unnoticed. A few nights later, Yossi woke up in excruciating pain. He itched and ached all over his body and couldn't figure out why. It wasn't until the sun rose he noticed he'd slept on a termite nest. After the first week, Yossi's food supply was gone along with his energy. He felt hunger like he'd never imagined. He searched for fruits and birds' eggs and ate dead monkeys when he spotted them. Despite his efforts to keep himself fed, Yossi quickly lost weight. To make matters worse, he was dehydrated, sleep-deprived, injured from the waterfall, and covered in termite bites. He really needed a break, but the jungle was not about to ease up on him. Once he finally got to sleep, he was abruptly awakened by the sound of a growl. As soon as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he realized he was staring straight into the eyes of a full-grown jaguar ready to pounce. With his heart beating nearly out of his chest, his instincts took over. He reached for his lighter and his mosquito repellent as fast as he could, creating a flamethrower to scare off the jag. Luckily it worked, but it became nearly impossible for a paranoid Yossi to fall asleep after that. The fauna of the jungle was an obvious threat, but the flora and climate were just as dangerous. When the foursome had become their hike, the rain season was still 2 weeks away, but now it came pouring down all day long, creating floods and threatening to drown Yossi once again. As Yossi was too busy trying to wade through the knee-deep water, he could no longer watch his step. Before he could correct his mistake, however, he found himself sinking into quicksand. Just when he accepted his fate, the floods moved and he pulled himself out. His socks and shoes had been wet and dirty for too long, and he began to develop a foot infection. To distract himself from the pain so he could keep walking, he did the only thing he could think of. Yossi rolled around on a nest of fire ants, letting them sting him everywhere. Adrenaline shot through his body and he found the strength to keep going. Out of nowhere, he noticed a woman beside him. He couldn't believe his eyes. They spent the next few days in each other's company, her presence reinforcing his will to live. But who was she? Several days later, he woke up without the pain, but also without the mystery woman. Seemed too good to be true. She'd been a hallucination. Upon this realization, Yossi fell to his knees, crying, and began to pray for his misery to end. Suddenly, he heard the vague sound of an engine coming from the river. He figured it was another plane that wouldn't notice him, but he followed the noise nonetheless. Once he reached the water, he noticed a boat in the distance. The boat was not only real, but also manned by Tiku Tudela, a Bolivian fisherman, along with Kevin Gale. Kevin had reached civilization in 3 days and begged the locals to help him look for his friend. Yossi was elated to see Kevin, but wondered what happened to Carl and Marcus. Yossi lost over 30 pounds during his 3 weeks on the verge of death. Meanwhile, Carl and Marcus were nowhere to be found. Yossi later learned that Carl was a wanted criminal who'd taken strangers into the jungle before. During the ensuing 3-month hospital stay, Yossi replayed the beauty and dangers of the jungle over and over in his head. Everybody who heard his story thought he was crazy, but he felt so thankful to the local people he wanted to return. When Yossi revisited Bolivia, the locals were delighted to see him. He moved there for a while and helped build an eco-lodge from which the indigenous people could profit. He also worked on protecting intellectual properties of people in that region. Yossi also published several books, including his own autobiography called Back from Tuichi, the harrowing story of survival in the Amazon rainforest, and traveled the globe giving inspirational speeches. His idol Henry Charrier would be proud. In 2017, Yossi's books were adapted into a movie called Jungle, and he was portrayed by no one other than Daniel Radcliffe. Of course, playing the part was a whole lot safer than living it. The movie, ironically, was available for streaming on Amazon. Kevin and Yossi remained friends. After appearing on the docu-series I Shouldn't Be Alive, Kevin was also involved with the production of Jungle. Although he continued pursuing his love for photography, he was not as eager to return to the rainforest as Yossi. The two survivors would never forget their fateful trip to the Amazon. They didn't understand why Carl took them into the forest, and they deeply mourned their lost friend Marcus. But their adventure changed their entire lives. Neither of them would have changed their decision to make that hike, even if they could.